Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar. My name is Konstantin Krivopustov. I am the product manager of Jmix. Today, we'll be talking about the new major release of Jmix, version 2.0. We'll start from discussing the updated technology stack and its implications. Then we'll explore improvements in Flow UI. After that, we'll look at the new features of Studio and then discuss the new authentication mechanism in generic REST. In the end, we'll talk about our future plans. Feel free to ask any questions you may have in the chat. Me and my colleagues will try to answer them. The updated technology stack is the main reason why we incremented the major version in this release. Jmix framework is now based on springboot 3.1, Spring Framework 6, Spring Security 6.1. We now use Vaadin 24 for Flow UI, Eclipse Link 4 for data access, and Flowable 7 as a BPM engine. The new versions of foundational frameworks provide a long enough period of support and stability for steady development of Jmix and its applications. The new stack has some new baseline requirements. Now you should use at least Java 17, both in development and production environments. And you need Tomcat 10 if you deploy your applications in WAR files. The bad news is that due to incompatibility between Vaadin 8 and the new Jakarta Servlet API in Spring 6, we had to remove the classic UI subsystem in this release. So now Flow UI is the main and only technology to build user interface in Jmix. If you have a project on Jmix 1.5 already with Flow UI, you can upgrade to 2.0 as usual using automatic migration in Studio. If your project uses classic UI, you have to migrate manually and replace the entire UI layer. One way to do it is to create a new project on 1.5 with Flow UI, copy your model and backend classes into it, and generate new CRUD views. Then migrate the new project to Jmix 2.0 using Studio, and finally customize the UI. It's obviously a difficult task, but there is no rush for updating to Jmix 2 if you have the classic UI. We'll provide the extended support period for Jmix version 1 until 2028, and you can find more information about it in our blog post called Extended Support for Classic UI. So now let's move on to the features. We implemented Flow UI for BPM, business calendars, email, and reports add-ons. So now they are available for using projects on Jmix 2.0. Let's take a look at the current UI of these add-ons. In BPM, you can see the same features, same set of features for creating processes at runtime as were available in classic UI. You have the modular with the process diagram and a set of tool panels for each type of node here at the right side of the application window. In business calendars, you can create a calendar, add some data. So actually the same as it was in classic UI. With the email add-on, you have the email history. It's now empty, but if I send a test email, you can see the record about it here. Again, the same set of features as in classic UI. Now let's take a look at the report designer. I will create a simple report using the wizard, user entity, XLSX, using query, next, add some attributes. and save the report. And here you can see that the general information about the report and the bands are now allocated on different tabs, which give them more space. Another difference is that because in most cases a band has a single data set, by default the designer just shows a query for this single data set. If you need more than one data set, select this multiple data sets checkbox, and you will get the full view as it was in classic UI. So overall, the current report designer is usable even on screens with low resolution. Now, let's take a look at the Flow UI components. First of all, we've almost completed porting the generic filter component. Now you can, if you create a set of conditions, you can save them as a configuration. And you will later have this configuration available in your application in the same view. And you can edit this this configuration, add some, for example, some grouping condition. Again, the same set of features as was in classic UI. The only thing missing now in Flow UI for the filter is the ability to set a configuration as default for the current user. It requires the view settings facet, which is not implemented yet. Another component added in this release is code editor. It is used in the report designer for writing queries, but we'll better look at it in our online demo. Yeah, it's on our website in the Learn section, demos. Here you can find the new online application, which demonstrates the UI components, UI samples. And the code editor, as you can see, it can have different syntax highlighting modes and different visual theme. In general, you should definitely check out this UI samples application when developing with Flow UI. We are working on it to provide more examples and explanations, so it will get better over time. The next improvement prevents loss of entered data if the user accidentally closes the browser tab. For example, if I open a detail view, and if I try to close the browser tab, it will show a standard notification about leaving the site. So I can change my mind and stay on the page. Now its behavior is by default on for entity detail views, but you can control it for any view with a special method. I can show it here in the detail view. I will generate init event handler and invoke this set prevent browser tab closing method with a false value. So this option is on by default for detail views and off for any other view. but you can turn it off or off or on, yeah, for any view as you want. So, okay, now let's look at the Studio improvements. They include new sections in Jmix tool window, enhanced inject dialog, and code generation improvements. After updating your Studio, you can immediately see that there is a new beans section in Jmix tool window. It displays all beans defined by the component or service annotation on the bean class. Beans created in Java configurations using the bean annotations are not shown here. In a large project, you can group beans by packages using this option. It actually affects other sections of the Jmix tree as well. The BPM section appears in your Jmix tool window if your project includes a BPM add-on. It contains two subsections, processes and process drafts. They are mapped to their respective directories, folders in your resources suite, processes and process drafts. They both contain process definitions, and definitions in the processes folder are automatically deployed to the BPM engine at the application start. Using these two folders, you can organize a simple workflow for developing processes. You start working on a process in the drafts folder here, and as soon as the definition is ready, you can use this action to copy the process definition to the processes folder to be deployed. Now my processes folder already have the process with the same name, so Studio warns me about it and suggests a new name. So this process will be deployed on application start. If something goes wrong with the deployment, most probably your application will not start at all. In this case, you can remove the process from this folder and copy it. If it doesn't exist as a draft, you can copy it back to process drafts to fix it later. And then your application will start successfully. Another improvement is in the inject dialog. Previously, this dialog contained only beans defined in the project in Jmix framework and the standard add-ons. So even beans from custom add-ons didn't show up there. Now it collects all beans from the whole class path, defined both in beans defined both by class level annotations and in Java configurations. As you can see, the beans are grouped by default, which can help you discover what beans are provided by some module. For example, here is a global process engine, process execution engine. For practical purposes, we filter out functional interfaces and interfaces that have more than 10 implementations. So for example, ubiquitous Spring initializing bean is not shown here because it just doesn't make sense for injection. The next improvement is in code generation. Sorry, just a moment, I'll open it from here. As you can see, all generated code is now supplied with final modifiers, and it doesn't produce warnings from IntelliJ with standard settings. If you think that it adds too much noise to your code, just go to the Jmix settings, plugin settings, and on the project settings tab, you can turn off this option. And another little improvement in Studio that you should pay attention to is usage of offset date time for timestamp attributes used in audit threads. So if I add an audit thread here, Studio will create a couple of attributes, and timestamp attribute created date will be by default of offset date time type. Of course, you can change it here, but just take into account that by default it will be offset date time, and your database will store timestamp with time zone. Okay, let's remove it and talk about the next Studio feature. It's quick cloud deployment. It's actually not new because we announced it as experimental feature last year, but it was hidden under a feature toggle. In release 2.0, we revised and significantly improved this feature, and now it's open and ready to use. First, let's talk about what it's intended for. The main goal is to provide an easy way to run your application outside your development environment for testing and demo purposes. You just follow a few simple steps, and Studio deploys and starts your application on automatically created AWS EC2 server. You don't need any specific knowledge about deployment or clouds. Of course, you can use it for production deployment too, but it will be suboptimal because it will not use any cloud services like databases or file storages, and it won't get the advantages. The application will just run in the same configuration as on your development computer. Anyway, it can be very useful, especially for solo developers, and save them from complicated and time-consuming setup. Let's see how it works. You need to register an account on AWS, install Docker on your local computer, and make sure you use Postgres and standard port 8080 in your project. Then you start the quick deployment wizard, quick cloud deployment. There is only one cloud provider at the moment, AWS. Perhaps we'll add more in the future. You can choose or generate a Docker Compose YAML file, which defines two services, one container for application and the second container for Postgres database. Then you click Start Deployment, and on the next step, you can create an AWS EC2 instance server. It's straightforward. You just select a region and the instance type, and you provide the AWS credentials. They can be stored on in your local folder, local home folder as a AWS profile, or you can enter them here in the window. Or you can use already existing server which you created before. If you hit run here, then the deployment starts. It will take several minutes. I will not start it again now. Instead, we will look at the server which was started when I rehearse this demonstration. So what you can do with running server, with the running application. First of all, you can connect to it in your web browser. Just open it in your web browser. Yeah. So actually it's the same application, but running on AWS. Next, you can stop or terminate the server. Be careful with terminating it because it completely destroys the server and all the data stored on it in the database and file storage will be lost. If you want to explore the contents of the server, you can connect to it by SSH. We provide this command line. You can open terminal, paste the command line, yeah, and yeah, it should connected to the server. So now we are on Ubuntu running in AWS cloud with our containers. You can also see the logs of the running containers. You have two containers. First for the application. You open this services window in the IDE, and under this node, you will find the Docker compose and the containers inside it. This is the log of the application, some exceptions from the web server, and the log of the database server. If you close connection for the server, you can reconnect at any time and get a fresh view of the logs. What is happening under the hood? How it works? How it deploys the application on the server? It's quite a complicated process. So Studio generates a Docker compose. Then when you start deployment, it creates a new EC2 server through the AWS API. Then it installs Docker on this server. Then it builds application, the Docker image with the application on the server. And after that, it runs a Docker compose with your application and Postgres containers. So it's actually quite easy for the developer. And probably you should give this feature a try next time when you need to demonstrate your application to people outside your office. Okay, let's move on. Another previously experimental feature that goes live in release 2.0 is Jmix authorization server. It's now the default way of authentication in GEN request. The old Jmix security OAuth2 module has been removed from 2.0 because it's incompatible with the new technology stack. And there was one more reason. OAuth specification defines multiple ways of obtaining access token. They are called grant types. And the old Jmix security OAuth2 module supported only the password grant, which was not recommended and even removed in the latest version of specification. New Jmix authorization server supports modern client credentials and authorization code grant types. They both have an advantage over the password grant in that they don't allow the client application to know the user password. The client credentials grant is similar to the old password grant. It should be used for server-to-server communication, such as integration with a third-party system, for example. Let's take a look at how to implement it in your application. On the server, you need to specify a set of Spring security properties. They define the client credentials, client ID, client secret, the grant type, client credentials, and a couple of other properties. Also, you should define a set of roles for this client in this Jmix property. So the code invoked by this client will be executed on the server with the security context of a special user with the username equal to client ID and this list of roles and their corresponding permissions. In other words, the client operates not as a real application user, but instead receives the static set of permissions defined by these roles. Now let's look at how the client can obtain the token in this flow. My client code is in Java unit test. So I have this test generic endpoint test, which invokes the authenticate method, which returns the token. And in the authenticate method, I create a HTTP request for this OAuth2/token endpoint. Well, this is the first difference from the old authentication method. Before it was just OAuth token without 2 in the end. And you provide the client credentials, client ID and secret in the basic authorization header. And in the request body, you just define what grant type is used. You don't provide user credentials here. This is the second difference from the old authentication method. As you can see, the client doesn't send any information about application user. It is authenticated and authorized only by its own client credentials. The token used in the subsequent API calls, just as before, in the authorization header of the request. So if I run this method, I should see some output about obtaining the token and returning the list of users. Yeah, so I got this token and then loaded the list of users from this endpoint. My client has rights to read users because I assigned the user management role to this client. And this user management role defines entity policies for the user entity. The second grant type is authorization code grant. It's more complicated, but it allows the client to operate on behalf of a real application user. It should be used in a front-end or mobile application where the client can show a login page provided by authorization server itself. Users will enter their credentials on that page, so the client again will not know the real user password. The new authentication mechanism can be used with custom controllers too. For example, I have this controller with a single endpoint, API users all. It returns the list of user names, and I define the URL for this endpoint URL pattern in Jmix REST authenticated URL patterns. So my custom endpoint will require an access token as the same as generic endpoint. And in my test class, I have the second test custom endpoint, which gets the token in the same way as for generic endpoint, and uses the token for my custom endpoint. So it produces the similar output. Here, yeah, I get the token and then return the list of usernames. I should warn you that there is a catch when using client credential grant. The user object returned from current authentication bin is of a special type derived from user details, but it's not the user entity of your project, and it cannot be cast to the user entity. So take it into account and check all code where you obtain and use the current user object. That's all about the features of Jmix 2.0. And now let's talk about the future plans. At the moment, we have a confirmed plan for the next release in October. It will include Flow UI for search, maps, notifications, dynamic attributes, and web dev add-ons. We also plan important additions to the Flow UI core, an equivalent of classic UI suggestion field, the view settings facet for saving user preferences, and data grid enhancements you will certainly find useful, such as property filtering, column headers, and sorting by multiple columns. Also, as planned before, we are going to make Spring data repositories first-class citizens in Jmix and provide some tooling and framework support to consume data from external sources. Well, our webinar comes to a close. Thank you very much for your attention. Now I'm ready to answer your questions. Let me look into the chat. Is it possible to define custom service task in BPM, send SMS? Max already answered that. Unfortunately, no, we didn't do it yet. But it's in our future plans, not defined the time frame at the moment. When would map, GIS, and HTML editor grade.js modules available? Yeah, we plan to have first version maps, in 2.1, right? So if there were not any questions anymore. Perhaps we can. Perhaps we can finish the webinar. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Oh, are there any plans for a UI component for grouping data grid? Yes, yeah, definitely yes. But it's a lot of work. We didn't start it yet, but we think that we can implement it next year. So definitely not this year, but maybe we'll start it this year. But yeah, it will be finished somewhere next year. Okay, thank you all. Have a good day. Bye.